it for us. So we'll talk about that later. And we will also talk about the shooting at Fort Hood. Another person died overnight. That brings the fatalities to 13. There are dozens more who will live with the injuries they sustained for the rest of their lives. And I think it's important here to understand what took place at Fort Hood. It was not a tragedy, as far too many people called it, including President Obama, and I regret to say George W. Bush. It was not a tragedy. A tragedy would be if a hurricane sweeps in, totals Fort Hood, and kills and injures a lot of people in their wake. This was not a tragedy. Instead, I think it exposed the potentially fatal flaw at the heart of what we've called, since September 11th, the war on terror. A great day for the Taliban or Al-Qaeda if it had happened in Afghanistan or Iraq. 13 Americans dead and dozens more wounded. And the least we can do when it happens not in Afghanistan or Iraq but at home is address honestly the motivations and the impulses that underpin the attack. The FBI, very curious statement this, the FBI announced almost within the first hour that this was not terrorism, that there was no terrorism angle. What is it? What is it then? I suppose they mean by that this man is not a registered member of a known terrorist group. They went through his pockets and they didn't find his membership card for the Texas branch of Al-Qaeda. That's a preposterous and reductive definition of terrorism. No, he wasn't a member of Al-Qaeda. He was a member of the United States Army. 2882 Open Line Friday on the Rush Limbaugh show. Over at National Public Radio earlier, apparently, they were saying, we know he took his faith seriously, but we can't say that was the issue. This is what it's going to be now. On Major Hassan. It will just be one of those things. Crazy, could happen to anyone. Post-traumatic stress disorder. The guy just suddenly snaps. He was worried about being sent into a war zone because, after all, he's not really a soldier. He's a doctor, and he was stressed out about it. And so even though he's not really a soldier, he seems to know his way around two handguns pretty good, well enough to go in and get off 45 shots. And take down the best part of 4 dozen people, but we can't say we can't say that this was about anything other than just some freakish combination of circumstances entirely unconnected to Islam or to his support for the enemy. In America's wars, this is not a tragedy. This is like 9/11. A failure of key systems and institutions to identify something central to the war that America is waging. And you can't think of it just as a question of military operations, about sending planes, sending in tanks. It's not like that. You win every war by throttling the ideology that is behind that war. Americans didn't have to have this pointed out 65 years ago. They knew that it wasn't just a question of an American plane taking out a German plane or an American tank blowing up a Japanese tank. They knew that in the end, that at the end of the day, Japanese militarism itself and that culture, that imperial militarist culture, had to be throttled. They knew that Nazism itself could not survive in the post-war order. And something has gone badly wrong when you have a U.S. Army major essentially saying the same kind of things that the enemy says, but he's saying it to his comrades, he's saying it to his superiors, and people are thinking, well, it's a free country, that's his right, what's the big deal about it? Let us go to Jeff in Richmond, Virginia. Jeff, you're on the Rush Limbaugh Show with Mark Steyn. Good to have you with us.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. As a veteran, this whole situation just pisses me off on every level there is, possibly. I mean, if this isn't a case of domestic terrorism, then what the hell fits the definition? I mean, if it was let's say, a twisted, sick individual, a white supremacist, or something along those lines that did it, it would be playing on loop on CNN probably for the next week at least. But, you know, as a veteran, it also, things like we can't call it the war on terror. We can't say terrorism, it's man-made disaster.
Right.
But the same people that dig and dig to come to this individual's defense that did this in Fort Hood, they're the same people that paint with the biggest damn brush they can the words right-wing extremism.
Yep.
Every chance they get, just for a different opinion. So, you know, for other Americans, we can go ahead and paint that evil description. Oh, well, that's just a possible right-wing extremist. But you get something like this, and oh no, that's an exception. That's different. He's the victim. He was picked on.
Yeah, imagine if, as this guy did yesterday morning, handing out the Quran to his neighbors. Imagine if a fella had been handing out Bibles to his neighbors on the morning before he goes and kills a bunch of people. Do you think the media would be regarding that as some peripheral detail of no relevance to his motivation?
Right. It's all agenda-driven, their agenda. I mean, how about we do this? Just call it what it is. You know, right or wrong, I don't care, but America's got to wake up because, I mean, sooner or later you got to understand that it is what it is. And it's just getting phenomenal in my mind, you know, especially as a veteran. I mean, it don't just affect the military. This affects us as a nation. And people still just, I don't know, just fumble around with the whole, this is a dangerous ideology.
Yeah, and as you say, this is actually the very definition of terrorism. That this is someone who is, it's actually a much more advantageous structure than, for example, Soviet agents had in the Cold War. In the Cold War, if you had some guy in Texas, he'd have to report to a control officer in Dallas or somewhere who would have some guy connected with the Soviet embassy in Washington who would be plugged into what the KGB were saying in Moscow. It's actually much more advantageous if you just have people in which you plant the seed, and they just kind of spontaneously combust. That you have a potentially huge numbers of freelance jihadists just out there who suddenly get the jihad fever and decide that today's the day that they're gonna go to paradise and see Allah, and they're gonna take a big bunch of infidels with them.